But what we realized actually, and you brought this up in a perfect way, when you start this cloud world, you're going to probably use your on-prem environment. You're going to use Azure as a cloud provider, but then you probably also use other cloud providers, and you use edge locations, factories, branch offices, and stuff like that. And one of the challenges, like as you pointed out, is connecting these together. And the other part, which is very important, is also to manage these environments, right? To actually have a governance and management and security strategy and tools to actually bring that all together. And like not necessarily depending on where your service is running, to use actually tools to have that single control plane to manage all of that, right? And I think that is exactly where Azure Arc can come in. So Azure Arc basically, on a very high level, what it can do is actually doing two things. So the first of all is bringing Azure Arc enabled services to any infrastructure. Now, this really is where where a customer came to us and said, well, look, we want, we love Azure SQL, for example, right? It's a great service. We want to use it, but we have this scenario where we need to use it in a place where, again, we have data sovereignty challenges, or we have no network connectivity, or the latency to the next Azure region is too high. So when a customer cannot really use our Azure services in Azure, let's take the Azure service and bring it to the customer, right? And that is what we call the Azure Arc enabled service. Now, the other part is actually then keeping control of that environment, managing that service, but also managing services which are already existing outside of your Azure infrastructure. And that is what we call the Azure Arc enabled infrastructure. And that allows us basically to connect servers, Linux and Windows, physical and virtual machines to Azure, and actually manage them as native Azure resources. And we can also add other resources like Kubernetes clusters or even SQL Server to that game as well. So that is really what I wanted to show quickly in that. And I think what better than just talking about this? Why not just show a quick demo on this?
Sure, let's do it. Whenever you're ready, here we are. So you got the portal up, and looks like you got about a bunch of resources. Why don't you tell me a little bit about them?
Yeah, absolutely. If you're familiar with Azure, you can see here I have my Azure resources here, and if I go to the All Resources tab, you can see here a list of all our cloud resources, right? And you can see here that everything here is basically an object. You can see here that object has a name. I'll zoom in here a little bit. It has a type. In this case, it can be a virtual machine, it can be a disk, it can be a database. Even a public IP address is a object, right? And each of these objects is part of a resource group to group these resources together. It's usually deployed to a location or in the Azure region. And then it's also part of a subscription. Now, this is all done by Azure Resource Manager. And I think this was a very good investment we did very early on with Azure, because we realized in the cloud, you have so many resources to manage, and you need to actually have a great tool to manage these resources at scale. And people liked it so much that they said, well, why can we not just use this instead of just managing Azure resources? Why not also bring in resources which are running outside of Azure? And that is exactly where Azure Arc comes in. And it helps us bridging these resources from on-premises or other cloud providers into Azure. And to show you that quickly, what I want to do here is I want to limit the view a little bit. So I'm going to click on type. And I only want to see right now my servers, right? So for that, I'm going to first select my Arc enabled servers. So these are servers running outside of my Azure environment. Some of them are running underneath my desk here in my little data center. Some of them even run at other cloud providers. So I'm going to select these. And you can see I already have 10 of these joined. And I will show you a little bit later on how you can add a server to that. What you also can see here, as I mentioned before, it's not just for servers. It can also be for Kubernetes clusters and SQL servers. And then they show up. But now, let's just say instead of just having the Arc-enabled servers, let's also have the Azure virtual machines side by side. So now, in my view here, you can see here, I can see all my servers running across my environment. So I get an inventory of that. And you can also see that these Arc-enabled servers, they're also part of a resource group. They're also joined to a location, and they're also part of a subscription. So they really are a native Azure resource. They're not just something which we just like showed up in the portal as a resource. The trick behind it really is that they're natively integrated into Azure.
So it's beyond just like visualization, and it becomes something that shows you this is just as much relevant and part of my resource group that I have my Azure SQL and Azure VMs. It's all part of that same view. And so I'm guessing that you can now go to one of those individual Arc-enabled servers and manipulate them from the Azure portal somehow.
Absolutely. And I'm going to show you that in just a bit. But you're absolutely right that this is one of the critical points here. I can now also go out and use things like tagging, right? Because it is a native Azure resource. I can add a filter here. And for example, filter for a tag. I have one for cost center. So I use that tag, and I want to list all my systems from one specific cost center here. So I limit that to cost center 1002, and I can apply now. And now you can see I have all my servers, which are running in Azure, but also on-prem or even at other cloud providers in one single view. And I can use the tagging for that. Now,
so if it's like two different departments, like say, maybe like the security department has a couple of servers they're responsible for. Maybe there's specific use cases. So the way I imagine it, Thomas, is like if we have dev, so different environments, a dev environment, we could tag them as dev. We have an environment for production or QA. We could put those in so we can kind of separate them in this view in the portal when we need to.
Absolutely, you're absolutely correct. The same way you would actually do this with Azure Resources. The point now is really that you can do this now with resources outside of Azure. And again, you're absolutely hitting the nail here on the head. It's like you can use it for tagging your different environments, your cost centers. You can use tags for all sorts of tooling. But what you also said before, you said like it's not just the UI thing, right? And you're absolutely correct. So what I'm going to show you here is I'm going to show you Azure Resource Graph. Now, for those who don't know Azure Resource Graph, this basically gathers all your all the information about your Azure environment. So it's a very fast system to actually get information like how many virtual machines do I run, what networks do I have, and so on, right? If you ever run like a get ACVM PowerShell command, if you have a couple of like hundreds virtual machines in Azure, this can take a while. But Azure Resource Graph actually does actually cache this information, so I can run queries against it using the keyword query language. And what I did here is I already prepared a query here. Oh, let me see that. I think that was the wrong one. Where I can list my Azure VMs, which have the resource type Microsoft.compute/virtual machines. So those are actually the resource type from Azure Resource Manager for Azure Virtual Machines. But then we'll have one for our Arc-enabled servers, which is hybrid compute machines. So I'm going to run this query. And this is now querying that from the Azure Resource Manager. And you can see here now, obviously, I get a list of all these machines. I could also run that query directly from the Azure CLI or Azure PowerShell, or query, like use the API to get that information. But it's exactly the same thing, right?
So I have...